Few things exemplify country life in England more than the simple cottage and its garden. A thatched or tiled roof, roses arching over rustic fence and trellis, honeysuckle and clematis on aging walls, and between the cheerfully painted front door and wooden gate, a marvelous multicolored jumble of flowers. This is the English cottage garden style as we have come to know it. An enduring image that artists, writers, photographers, and garden lovers have universally embraced. But the English cottage and garden as we know it today wasn't always this vision of rural innocence. This icon of countryside contentment was born in a time when medieval labourer and peasant cottager survived on the meagre offerings of the small plots of land surrounding their roughly built dwellings. The purpose of this fenced or walled enclosure was to contain livestock and to provide medicinal and culinary herbs and vegetables, all vital to self-sufficiency and even survival. Any flowers grown in these early gardens were more likely to be used in cooking and for strewing on the floors to dispel vermin and odors. For several centuries, cottage life remained a harsh existence of primitive shelter, poor diet, and unremitting labor. It wasn't until the end of the 17th century that cottage gardens started to resemble those of today. Ironically, it was members of the gentry who, tiring of the gardening trends of the time and seeking a more simplistic approach to the land and life in general, began to emulate the cottage garden style. By Victorian times, this nostalgia for the pastoral and romantic was well established. Nowhere is it more evident than in the watercolor paintings of cottages and gardens by a number of famous artists of the day, including Miles Burkitt Foster and Helen Allingham. Garden writers, too, led by Gertrude Jekyll and William Robinson, found much inspiration in these unpretentious and charming gardens that beckon with cheerfully painted faces across the English countryside. Yew Tree Cottage is the oldest dwelling in the village. It is over 600 years old. The only decorative embellishment is the hanging tile on exterior walls. It stands today very little changed from times past. The garden at Yew Tree was created over 30 years ago by its owner, Kathleen Hudson, who is nearing her 90th year. Since that time, she has tended it year-round, day in, day out, single-handedly. On the rare occasions when Kathleen is not to be found in her garden, chances are she'll be at her easel. Her brilliant floral art has been published internationally. The garden is really two separate and distinct gardens. The first is the area adjacent to the house, which has a small central lawn with gracefully curving edges surrounded by deep beds. The pathway into the garden leads under a rustic arch, which is host to the English rose, Constance Spry. A handsome old iron chair invites a rest in this sunny, flagstone-paved corner with its cheerful pots of flowers. Every now and again, there's a pleasant surprise. With the mind and eye of the artist, Kathleen's garden is punctuated with still life vignettes. Kathleen had some personal insights about her garden and gardening in general that embodied more inspiration than could ever be found in many glossy books.
Now, a garden like mine can be run by anybody single-handed. I do all the work in this garden myself. Apart from the last 2 years, I've had the grass cut for me. I do the edges still because I like to keep an eye on the plants near the edge. And I've done all the planting. Everything in this garden has been planted by me, and I've had enough time to make mistakes, because if I put something in and I walk back to the cottage and think, oh no, that's in the wrong place, I can move it, or take it out altogether, or give it to a friend if you really don't like it. Don't keep anything in your garden that you don't like. I think it was Vita Sackville-West who always said, always have the best. If you see a better plant than the one you've got, chuck the one you've got. Now, I'm not sure about everybody, but I do insist that anybody can do what I do. I'm quite lame now. I've had 2 major operations in the last 2 years, and yet I'm still gardening. Every morning when I get up, I come down in the garden, whether it's raining or not, and walk down into this spot here. And I usually have the neighbour's cat who comes with me. And I see what needs to be done. I don't necessarily, I usually have something with me, like a hoe. But I think to myself, yes, that needs staking, or I must cut that back.
At the foot of the garden, a small brick and pebble path leads to Kathleen's second garden. This is much more in the cottage style than the main garden. It also features many plants and shrubs which bloom in the later months. This is Kathleen's sanctuary, where you'll find her plotting the next perennial divisions or simply musing on past successes or near misses.
The seat I'm sitting on repeatedly came from Edinburgh Prison, and I often think of prisoners sitting on it, but certainly not looking out onto a little garden like this, which I call it my Jekyll garden, because I was given a book about Gertrude Jekyll just at the time that I decided to give up vegetables. And instead of all the curves I've got in my other garden, I wanted a straight line and a lovely archway and a seat. This is a late garden, really. When a lot of the things are over in the other garden, I have all the late stuff here. I've got a lot of asters and astilbes and filipendulas and all things that die gracefully. I think that's very important. And I've got quite a lot of clematis in the garden. In fact, I've got 12 clematis. I don't like bright colours, and although I love the hot garden at Sissinghurst, I haven't room for it here, and I do avoid reds and oranges and colours like that.
It has been suggested that cottage-style gardening is perhaps an extension of the English character itself. If so, then there could be no better example than that of Kathleen Hudson and her garden at Yew Tree Cottage. It speaks, as she does, with joy, without pretense, and most certainly from the heart. The joyous bubblings and splashing of water fills the air and greets the eye. This is the exuberant country garden at Upper Mill Cottage, which has now settled comfortably into its present character after 2 decades of diligence and nurturing by the owners David and Mavis Seeney. In England, this would be best described as a plantsman's and plantswoman's garden. The phrase, though somewhat imprecise, refers to those gardeners who grow from seed and cuttings and tend to specialize in unusual or rare plants. Like most gardens of character, Upper Mill is not the progeny of a contrived plan or design. It all started with the cottage-style plantings close to the house. Through the years, the garden has evolved one stage at a time through experimentation, uprootings, transplantings, and lots of time spent on hands and knees to arrive at its present enchanting personality. With characteristic modesty, David Seeney summarized the making of his garden.
Nearly 300 years ago, this site was an old water mill, which of course accounts for the water courses, all man-made, and they were used to power the mill. about 1908 it all became derelict and the mill packed up, and the site itself was overgrown and covered in old trees and weeds and things, and we bought it 20 odd years ago to make a garden. And with a bit of hard work and a little bit of effort and a bit of tender loving care, we've created the garden that you see today. I would emphasise that we're both a couple of amateurs, and we haven't been trained at all. We like getting our hands dirty with the plants, and Mavis is considered quite a plantswoman in her own right now. We grow a great number of plants from seed, which we collect all over the place. You can't buy a lot of the plants in the garden from garden centres.
Some areas of the garden are disciplined by gracefully curved lawns. Others are luxuriant and playful, where the water becomes airborne. And there are those that dazzle with colourful mass plantings, like these foxgloves, some of which are left to self-seed every year. And then there is the uncommon, like the lovely blue Meconopsis poppy Harlow strain, and this most unusual primrose. Another area of the garden offers a soothing present of green and gold foliage that underscores the often overlooked use of shrubs and trees as principal players in the garden, and not, as is usually the case, just those with walk-on parts. Mavis Sini had a few comments about the manner in which she obtains and grows plants for her garden.
Most of the plants in the garden are grown from seeds and cuttings. We've been very lucky in that we've been able to acquire a few seeds from people who've been away on plant finding expeditions, and they distribute seed to one or two people who they know are very keen to grow them. We've had lots of failures, of course, but we're quite pleased with what we have grown, and people who come to visit the garden are always interested to see the unusual plants that are around. Some they don't approve of completely because they're not particularly elegant or pretty or colourful, but I will grow anything if it's unusual, just to see what comes out at the end of the packet. And nothing grows if you leave it in a packet anyway, so everything gets tossed in. And sometimes funny things come up, but that's how you find the unusual plants, really.
Gardens like Upper Mill Cottage are harder to leave than most. There's always the gnawing probability that much has been missed. But in this case, it's perhaps more because of the scenes themselves. Because their ingenuous approach to gardening, their imagination and industriousness, not to mention a good measure of infectious humour, is reflected in every leaf and petal of this masterful garden. At the height of summer, Camp Cottage cannot be seen from the road or even the entrance gate. A dense screen of vegetation shields it from the outside world and provides a lush preview of what lies beyond. The postcard-perfect whitewashed cottage, which historians believe existed within Oliver Cromwell's camp, assumes a comfortable position in the midst of this boisterous garden. Plants and shrubs brush up against its half-timbered walls as if at any moment to swallow it up completely. The thick curtains of flowering shrubs, trees, herbaceous planting and arbors, creaking under the weight of tangled masses of climbing roses and vines, would suggest that this is a garden that has been years in the making. It was, in fact, started from scratch in 1988, only 7 years before these pictures were taken. Created by Les Holmes with help from his stepbrother Sean, the garden at Camp Cottage is a glorious congregation of informal planting where every centimetre of space has been spoken for. It's as if the 1 acre garden contains the entire encyclopedia of plants and flowers. With its maze-like quality, losing a sense of direction is inevitable. The only compass is the occasional glimpse of the almost camouflaged TV area, the only visual link with the 20th century at Camp Cottage. A more inquisitive eye might notice Les's partiality for certain cottage flowers like hardy geraniums, clematis, and such. They tend to appear in greater numbers and varieties, though few plants get special billing. One exception is this fine collection of evergreen perennial sempervivum, also known as house leek. Poet, author, and gardener Vita Sackville-West wrote, "The most noteworthy thing about gardeners is that they are always optimistic, always enterprising, and never satisfied. They always look forward to doing better than they have ever done before." These traits certainly describe Les Holmes, the mind and heart behind this storybook garden at Camp Cottage. He talked about its beginnings and its evolution.
Well, we came to this cottage and garden in 1987. We, meaning my stepbrother Sean and myself, all we found was a very large field with 7 trees. This side of the garden hadn't been touched for about 60 years. Apparently it was a vegetable garden originally, and I wanted what I call a very old type cottage garden. And we set about creating this garden the following year, May 1988. And I didn't put anything on paper, it was purely something I could see in my mind how I would like to do it. So we had a go, making beds here and beds there, creating pathways. And slowly it evolved, it just grew. Yes, there are thousands of plants in the garden now. I've had many given to me, and I visit plant sales and nurseries, and I grow lots from cuttings and seeds, and of course there are now thousands in the garden. I suppose I shall go on doing this for many more years, at least I hope I shall. And I have particular interest in certain plants. Old roses are a great love. And also lots of the herbaceous plants, campanulas, hardy geraniums, pulmonarias. There are great collections of all of those in this garden. And, I'm willing to try any type of plant, put it that way. I do have a secret, if you like to call it that, idea at the back of my mind. There is a very large field next to this garden, comprising about 8 acres, and I can only see about 4 of those acres, and I keep saying if I should win the national lottery that we now have in this country, I might make a bid, who knows?
On one side of the busy street that threads through the village, swans, cygnets, ducks, and their fluffy ducklings bob along the shallow waters of the River Colne. On the other side, an even more delightful attraction is provided by the gardens of Swan Cottages. The old honey-colored limestone cottages act as a sympathetic backdrop to the parade of summer color and fragrance that captures those passing by. Through the simple wooden gate, a straight path embroidered with pansies, carnations, penstemon, nigella, roses, and a potpourri of other annuals and perennials leads to the front door of Lillian and Ian Muir's cottage. Nearby, the lovely climbing rose Albertine smothers an arbor which offers an irresistible invitation to explore the small garden at the side of the cottage. Beds and borders in the front gardens are a cornucopia of cottage plants and flowers. But unlike gardens of earlier times, with their more abandoned approach to planting and reliance on self-seeding, these have a greater sense of orderliness. Nevertheless, most of the plants expected of a true cottage garden are in residence. Roses of all kinds in great abundance, fiery-coloured penstemon, bright gaillardia, the painted faces of cistus, or rock rose, hortidelphiniums, honeysuckle, pansies, salvia, few are absent. Fences are of wood and very simple. An old stone trough serves as a planter, and the occasional statue peeks out of the dense foliage. As do other inhabitants of this lovely environment. Approximately 1/4 of the garden is reserved for growing vegetables. While he provides support for the flower garden, this is the exclusive domain of Ian Muir. With its year-round supply of potatoes, lettuce, beans, carrots, beets and more, trips to the greengrocers or vegetable counters are virtually unknown in your household. Echoing the sentiments of other cottage gardeners, Lillian Muir commented on her garden and her preference in allowing nature to make most of the decisions for her.
We came 5 years ago and we decided as it's a cottage, it had to be a cottage garden. As you can see, we love the pansies. They just grow wherever they want to grow. We love roses. We both like gardening, it's very enjoyable here. As you can see, so many people are always around and looking at the garden. We love the cistus. We've started planting several of them now, and penstemons, which we like, and the Canterbury bells, I like, which are just coming out now. We like things higgledy-piggledy. We don't like things in a straight row. My father used to have everything in a straight row, but we don't like it. We like things just to come up naturally.
A question to ponder. Is it because nice people tend to garden, or is it gardening that makes people nice? One thing is certain, that much beauty, love and nice feelings are to be found in the Muir's pleasant garden in Gloucestershire. Showing all the individual plants and flowers in each garden is of course not possible, but here's a close-up look at just a few of the old-fashioned cottage garden favorites. If this were a quest for the prettiest village in England, it might end here. All the cottages are thatched, fastidiously groomed and gardened. Leaving one end of the village, it would be easy to miss the narrow lane with sheep grazing contentedly in the next meadow. At the end of this pathway, well hidden from the road, is another thatched cottage built at least 300 years ago. This is the home of Mr. Townsend, also known to friends and neighbours as the King of Lettuce. Much like its counterparts of centuries past, the garden at Lane Cottage is planted more with regard to what it can provide for the table, as opposed to the aesthetic. Here it is not the flowers, but vegetables that are almighty. and generous helpings of this non-stop bounty of produce, lettuce in particular, end up daily on the Townsends' plates and those of neighbours and relatives. It was 45 years ago that the first seeds were planted, the day the Townsends moved in.
I've been here since 1950, and it was in a mess when we came here. It was all overgrown. It had been, the cottage had been empty for 10 or 15 years. And we had to chop away into it to get the garden going.
From early morning to dusk, almost every day of the year, Mr. Townsend can be found engaged in the pursuit of growing more and better vegetables. The part of the garden devoted to flowers, Mrs. Townsend's domain, which originally occupied more than half the property, has slowly yielded over the years to annexation by the advancing columns of cauliflowers, carrots, beans, peas, potatoes, leeks, and of course, umpteen varieties of lettuce. It seems, however, that the line has now been drawn, and Mrs. Townsend's pansies, aubrietia, roses, chrysanthemums, delphinium, and other traditional cottage flowers now have their safe haven from the marauding veggies in the long, tapered border. It took a little coaxing to get Mr. Townsend to comment on his commendable kitchen garden and to explain how he came by his vaunted title, the King of Lettuce.
Well, I gave it to myself more or less as a joke, really. My wife's friend made the comment that I got lettuce all over the garden, and I normally plant like once a fortnight, so I got a succession all the time. During the summer, my wife and I normally eat lettuce most days, and as soon as tomatoes and that come in, we have tomatoes and cucumber, which I grow myself. The main aim of growing it is so that we've got fresh vegetables the whole year round. During the summer, any surplus of peas or runner beans, broad beans and carrots, we freeze so that we've got a good supply during the winter if we've got no other vegetables available. My wife does most of the flowers. She plants the seeds and does all the pricking out, and I assist her planting them out into the garden, and the chrysanthemums, we do that between us, and she does all the disbudding of the flower. I think young people who don't do gardening are definitely missing out on something. There's nothing like going into the garden, getting a fresh lettuce or potatoes. These you buy from the supermarkets aren't a patch on fresh vegetables.
Musing on the subject of the monumental quantity of lettuce he had actually grown over the 45 years in his cottage garden, Mr. Townsend had only one comment.
They don't call me the King of Lettuce for nothing.
In not too many years, it's possible that the garden at Lane Cottage and others like it could cease to exist. Perhaps if the taste of his lettuce, potatoes or peas and the wisdom of the King of Lettuce were to have a greater audience, it might provide inspiration and incentive for future generations to make sure that this unassuming and rewarding style of English gardening culture is not lost forever. Engaging in conversation with Angela Winfield on the subject of her garden at Snake Cottage is a fascinating as well as an educational experience, because she will only grow two types of plant, those that have historic pedigrees that interest her, or those that she really likes. Many of the plants here are in fact hundreds of years old, as if they were some long-lost country kin She will often introduce her plants and flowers by their quaint old-fashioned names like Hattie's Pincushions, Melancholy Gentleman, and Jack in the Pulpit. Hers is a garden that is very special in many ways.
We've been here at Snape Cottage in Dorset for the last 7 years, but my interest in gardening really began 15 years ago when I read Cottage Garden Flowers by Marjorie Fish. And I'd always been interested in history, and just reading about the old flowers that were described by Mrs. Fish made me want to try to collect as many of them as I could, because so many were in danger of becoming extinct and lost to cultivation. And the garden here is also very much based on conservation of the countryside and the wildflowers as well. So I do tend to grow a lot of plants that people call weeds, which I prefer to call British native flowers. And I find that if I label and feed plants that would otherwise be despised in the countryside, people see them growing well in the garden and then want to grow them in their own gardens. So I hope that something of what we're doing here will inspire other people to do the same and conserve old and rare plants.
For its relatively compact size, there are more areas of interest and intrigue than many gardens twice as large. A long rose arch with lush borders on both sides. A 17th century and a medieval garden. A wildlife pond home to frogs, newts and dragonflies. A small wild garden. And many other borders and beds dedicated to herbaceous plants, even one reserved only for penstemon. And of course, there's a space for vegetables.
There are so many thousands of flowers and plants here in the garden now. It's very difficult to just choose a few to speak about, but plants with aromatic foliage or those that the flowers are scented, particularly these old dianthus or old-fashioned garden pinks, are amongst my very favourite flowers, and some of them are hundreds of years old. Also, a lot of herbal plants are included, not in a particular herb garden as such, but really scattered amongst the other flower beds all through the garden. A lot of people have lost the art of appreciating fragrance and find it difficult to know how to release the smell from many plants. They don't realise that you have to actually gently crush and smell the leaves of plants, but when they do and discover this, it's quite a revelation to many people.
To those gardeners accustomed to stocking up on plants at the local nursery, it is difficult to visualise how a garden of such bounty and beauty could materialize exclusively from seeds, cuttings, and tiny scraps of plant life given to Angela over the years by gardening friends. The garden at Snape Cottage is a joy to behold, and a brilliant lesson in what can result from a true understanding and respect for wildlife and the land. Snape Cottage is also a member of Bed and Breakfast for Garden Lovers, a group of more than 40 bed and breakfast properties located throughout Britain that share a love for gardens and gardening. The garden at East Lambrook Manor, though by no means as illustrious as those at Sissinghurst, Hidcote or even Barnsley House, occupies a special niche in the chronicles of England's gardening history. It was here in 1938 that gardener and writer Marjorie Fish, along with her husband Walter, set about creating a cottage-style garden designed to feature and preserve many wild and traditional plants of the 19th century. which otherwise would have been lost to cultivation forever. Since 1958, the garden has been sympathetically restored and is beautifully maintained by the now owners, Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Norton. Despite the lack of elbow room for plants here, they seem to flourish and multiply willy-nilly, particularly the geraniums. The planting in certain areas is so overpopulated that even the question of photographic perspectives becomes difficult. Through her personal gardening experience, Marjorie Fish accumulated a wealth of botanical knowledge and wisdom, with a positive like and dislike of certain plants. She has delighted, educated, and gained many garden disciples through her books and lectures. Her observations on garden design and function were equally acute. In my idea of a perfect garden, she wrote, there must always be something to catch the eye, to keep up interest. And for this we need the handmaidens as well as the stars. The gardens that are remembered are those that lure you on. No one wants to linger in a garden that has no surprises. But if a whole garden is competing at once, there is a tendency to pay less attention to its treasures than if they were discovered in unexpected places. Following her own advice, Marjorie Fish orchestrated a labyrinthine journey through the 2-acre garden at Lambrook Manor, where each twist and rise or fall of the snaking path divulges yet another aspect, another surprise, in this wonderland where apple trees grow roses and where there is a pervasive feeling that almost anything is possible. The garden is also renowned for its national collection of cranesbill, or hardy geraniums as they are also called. From tall to tiny, this delightful family of perennial plants, which grow wild in many countries of the world, have become an indispensable part of every cottage-style garden in England. I could go on and on, said Marjorie Fish, but that is just what gardening is, going on and on. My Philistine of a husband often told with amusement about a cousin who asked him when he expected to finish his garden. He replied, "Never, I hope," and that, I think, applies to all true gardeners. For anyone new to gardening, or those who lack courage, or the conviction that gardens can be created even from the most hostile conditions, there can be no better inspiration than the garden at Ash Tree Cottage. The prospect that confronted Wendy and Len Lauderdale when they decided to make it their home and create their garden would have daunted even the most blithe optimist. In more ways than one, it was not a pretty sight. Today, little more than 10 years later, old roses, campanula, delphiniums, and a vast plant community radiate from earth that was once in the vice grip of nettles, tussock grass, brambles, and assorted rubbish. The land around the lovely old flint and brick cottage, once owned by the village wheelwright, is now chock-a-block with what appears to be an inexhaustible parade of roses, shrubs, and flowering plants. On all sides, the pretty cottage is engulfed with an amazing ebb and flow of color and foliage. Although Wendy admits to staking some of the giants in the borders, most of the plants are packed in so tight that there's no way that they can droop or topple. Each bed or border appears deeper or denser than the next, all of them bursting at the seams, putting on a non-stop exhibition of herbaceous colour. A long pergola leads to the door of the cottage. Overhead, climbing roses, clematis and honeysuckle weave in and out of the timber crossbars above. Under planting is a continuous band of purple nepeta, anthemis and viola cornuta. Walls are provided by shrub roses and campanula. If one is not bowled over by the sight, then the perfume will certainly do the job. For a gardener to have a love affair with roses is not uncommon, but it seems that Wendy Lauderdale has been irreparably smitten by this queen of flowers. Her insatiable affection embraces many varieties, with shrub roses and the dainty Rosa glauca her favorite. Whether they are massed together, stand on their own, or mingle in the beds, in this garden it becomes easy to understand why the rose has always been the most beloved of all the cottage flowers. The garden at Ashtree Cottage, which now has its own plant nursery, is an object lesson in persistence, passion and caring. The brilliant accomplishment of one person who, in the span of little more than a decade, starting with sparse knowledge and little to work with, has created a small world of enormous beauty and substance. As seems to be typical of gardeners, soft-spoken Wendy Lauderdale needed little urging when it came to reminiscing and her infatuation with all things horticultural.
It's become something of a passion and become the garden that you see today. Obviously one goes on learning and my ideas change and tastes change as I find more and more plants. I was once asked what my philosophy is as far as gardening is concerned and what advice I would give to anyone else. And I merely said, enjoy it. It's your garden, you work in it, you live in it, do your own thing, and above all else, just enjoy it.